And good evening, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called Macduff Lives. And tonight, I'm very happy to bring back to our show Mike Billington. Mike Billington is a veteran of the Larouche movement and a veteran of 10 years of incarceration as a result of the Larouche movements getting harassed and by none other than Robert Swan Mueller and the politicians of that day. Mike is someone who has written about his knowledge, his experiences, and this book here, you can get it on Amazon. I'm just delighted and honored that Mike has joined us once again, and we're going to talk tonight about something I don't know much about, and that is Africa and the attempts of various big financial institutions to perhaps profit maybe in unethical ways, but we'll learn more about that from Mike Billington tonight. Good evening, Mike.
Good to be on. Thank you, John.
And thanks for doing that. Well, Africa. Let's talk about what's at stake in Africa. Why would the Bank of England be making this gesture towards Africa?
Well, as you know, they're preparing for the COP26 in Glasgow in November. This is the newest round of the Green New Deal Great Reset operation to impose a policy on the world not run by governments, but run by the financial institutions, that the Bank of England and key Wall Street and Federal Reserve, but basically central bankers from around the world, have gathered forces and declared that under Mark Carney's leadership, the former head of the Bank of England, now the UN czar for climate change, declared that henceforth we will not extend credit to anything that has carbon footprint. Fossil fuels will be denied credit. Industry, agriculture, transportation, anything which has carbon emissions will be denied credit. So you've seen a virtual takeover of governments by the private banking system, who are declaring that they henceforth shall be in charge of the national economies, not the elected governments, not the sovereign governments, but the banks. With Mark Carney, that man you see there at the core, the man who has worked hand in hand with Prince Charles for many, many years in creating this myth that carbon is affecting climate change, that carbon is going to burn the world up if we don't stop it, which means we have to stop fossil fuels, we have to stop industry, we have to stop agriculture. We have to impose a policy which in fact has been the British imperial policy from the beginning of the British Empire, the Malthusian policy that says, on the one hand, there's too many people, they're eating up the limited resources, which is a myth. There's not limited resources, and I can discuss that. But also that there is an Aristotelian view of man, that some people are born masters and some people are born slaves, and it shall be so forth henceforth. This is the imperial racist view of the British Empire, which is now being restored under the guise of the new Green Deal. So Mr. Carney went to a preparatory meeting for the COP26 in Glasgow on Africa. And he basically laid it all out. No bars hold. He admitted everything that is the real intention of their genocide, their Malthusian depopulation of Africa. You want me to go ahead and go through that a little bit?
Well, I'm shocked to hear that he would have admitted to genocide. In so many words, but yeah, let's hear some of the details.
This will be in the next issue of EIR, which comes out. Actually, it came out yesterday. It came out next week. I'm sorry, but what he said was this: we are setting up a carbon market, and part of the carbon market, where you have to pay if you emit too much carbon, but you can get a carbon offset, which means that if you're emitting carbon and you don't want to stop emitting carbon, which supposedly is going to burn the world up, you can plant trees, or you can get carbon offsets from other people who are not emitting carbon. And the good Mark Carney said to Africa, you'll get rich with carbon offsets as long as you agree not to cut down any trees and not to develop your resources, because they are a great resource for carbon offsets. And he said, literally, companies like Microsoft, who emit plenty of carbon, need an offset on the carbon market, and they will come to you and pay you to not cut down trees, to not develop your resources, to not build no cities, not build any kind of industries, to remain backwards, but you'll be paid well with carbon offsets. Then, just to drive the imperial point home, he said, however, keep in mind that these are private industry deals, and people like Microsoft are going to need to have assurances that your offsets are permanent, that you're never going to cut down any trees or develop your resources. So they will have to send people to reconcile, to verify and to monitor your promises not to develop. And as long as you do that, and as you allow us green police, which is really the new colonial governors, if you think about it, coming in to make sure that you never, ever develop your resource. You remain backwards forever. You'll get a lot of money. You can go buy a nice TV set, but you cannot become a modern industrial nation. This is the explicit, stated policy of the Great Reset, the Green New Deal. Keep Africa backward, prevent them from developing their energy, and this will mean literally the mass murder of the African population, which is already taking place under the pandemic, but also under famine and deindustrialization. That's what we're dealing with here, is a new British Empire under the guise of the Green New Deal to impose Malthusian depopulation on a global scale at the same time that they basically destroy the industrial infrastructure in the advanced sector.
Well, John F. Kennedy in his inaugural address said that we were going to help the countries of the undeveloped world. We were going to lend them a hand. We were going to help them to get the infrastructure and the education systems and the health systems and all the things they needed to really thrive as a nation, as a sovereign nation. And well, we lost John F. Kennedy. We also lost our compass, I think, as a nation, because the compass dial seems to have spun far away from that guiding star that John F. Kennedy laid out for us. But here we are. We're still the most powerful nation, we think, on the planet. How is it that we let Great Britain, or the people that, like Prince Charles, oops, I said his name, these folks, why is it that we let them get away with this?
Well, you're right about John Kennedy, and he was, because he was committed to that, he was assassinated. And he was assassinated by the British, by the way. We have plenty of documentation on the role of the British through Canada and through others here in the US who orchestrated the Kennedy assassination. Why? Precisely for the reason you said. He absolutely rejected the British and the American sycophants to the British, who said we have to stop communism in every country, and people like Lumumba are communists. We have to kill them. And they did. They killed Lumumba. Kennedy personally, as a senator, had said Lumumba is a nationalist. There are communists there, but he wants to develop his country. And we have to support that inspiration to develop that country. But I would go back further than Kennedy. I would go back to Roosevelt. Roosevelt told Winston Churchill to his face during the war that we're not fighting this ugly war in order to save your damn British Empire. And Churchill said, over my dead body, but he meant it. And unfortunately, he died. We don't have any evidence he was killed. He was sick, and you had a total Wall Street puppet, Truman, come in, who helped the British and the French and the Dutch to move their troops back into their colonies instead of doing what Roosevelt said, which is that we're going to use American system methods to develop these countries that were held backwards for hundreds of years by European colonialism and neocolonialism. Unfortunately, what Truman did was quite the opposite. He helped them back, and as a result, we had 30 years of ugly colonial warfare in Vietnam, especially in Southeast Asia, but also in Africa, which were totally unnecessary. There was no need for those wars if we had followed Roosevelt's policy of working hand in hand with Russia and China in the development of the third world and replacing colonial backwardness in the developing sector with development. And of course, it's extremely important to point out that one of the primary reason they hate China so much and make up all these crazy stories about China is because China has adopted the policy introduced by Lyndon and Helga Larouche for the Belt and Road, for the New Silk Road, to use the methods that they used to transform China into one of the most powerful nations in the world from total backwardness, which was build infrastructure. And they took that policy into Africa and South America, and they told these countries, the key here, what keeps you in poverty and backwardness is the lack of basic infrastructure. Because the IMF World Bank policy was always appropriate technologies. My little black brothers, I know you'd love to have a great big dam and a high-speed rail, but that's not appropriate for your level of development, you see. We'll help you with new picks and shovels, and we'll help you get your crop from your 1 hectare property to market, but we're not going to build big infrastructure. Forget it. And the Chinese came in and said, that's the key. You want to become a modern industrial nation? The old Chinese saying is, if you want to be rich, first you build a road. And that's the policy, is build infrastructure. This is the American system. This is what Alexander Hamilton fought for, to replace the control of private banks in the British system with a national bank policy whose purpose was to create what they called internal improvement, basic infrastructure. This is the American system being applied by China. Isn't that ironic? While the Americans are following the British system of turning the policies over to the private banks in the form of the Green New Deal. So a very ironic situation, but a very, very dangerous one. The alternatives here are, on the one hand, not only Malthusian destruction and starvation and the pandemic raging without halt, but also the threat of nuclear war, threat of a confrontation with the US and Russia and China, instead of working with Russia and China to actually, as Roosevelt intended, to actually bring about a common aim for mankind, a development process which could relieve the developing sector of this curse of backwardness and colonial racism, really.
Well, there was an incredible amount of interest of money behind the idea of developing the whole nuclear weapons regime that came in with the 50s with the Cold War, and all of that was against what Roosevelt would have wanted, I believe. It was brought in under Eisenhower, and it kind of set up this mutually assured destruction scenario where hopefully nobody was going to be stupid enough to start war between the U.S. and Russia, or after China got the bomb with China either. That supposedly has ended with the supposed fall of the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union got taken over by a lot of disparate people, some related to the KGB and others. You know, we've got, of course, Putin now, but a lot of folks are saying, well, Putin is a nationalist. Putin is doing what's best for Russia, no longer fighting the Cold War. Nevertheless, when it's politically expedient, our politicians here have no trouble in claiming that the Cold War is still going on and that we should be afraid of Russia. Let me ask you about Russia now. We've talked a little bit about China. Is Russia making efforts to help development in Africa, for instance, or other places in the world?
Well, Putin has pledged what he calls lighting up Africa. If you look at one of these fascinating space photographs of the Earth at night, you see the tremendous light across Europe and the Americas and so forth, and virtual darkness in Africa. It really brings home the idea of the dark continent. They don't have electricity. Something in the range of 50 to 60% of the African population that still doesn't have electricity. This is an abomination. And Putin has said several years ago, actually, he said, we're going to light up Africa. How are we going to do it? With nuclear power. We're going to bring modern science, safe, clean nuclear power as the basis for transforming Africa into what it could and should be one of the richest continents in the world. Tremendous raw material wealth, actually fairly significant skilled labor, although you also have a huge layer of totally impoverished rural labor. But you have the potential for Africa becoming the fastest growing, sort of like China has been over the last 30 or 40 years, coming from extreme backwardness and poverty into being a tremendous producers of great wealth, real wealth, scientific and technological wealth, not just raw materials. So the potential is there. I'll mention that, it's important for people to think about what mutual assured destruction really means. And this is what Larouche was thinking of when he proposed the idea of what became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, what we called beam weapon defense. The idea was mutual assured destruction says they can blow us up, we can blow them up, therefore nobody's going to go to war. This is going to stop the danger of nuclear war. Yeah, okay, but it also means you maintain a total division of the world into conflicting blocks. There'll never be the world working together for what we really need for the common aims of mankind, because we're forever trapped in this geopolitical division of the East versus the West, freedom and democracy and those horrible authoritarian dictatorships in Russia and China. This was the ideology. And what Larouche posed to Ronald Reagan was, I will work with the Russians. I'll be a back channel connection with the Russians to propose that we work together with the tremendous scientific capacity in the West and in Russia, which is mostly tied to the military-industrial complex in Russia, but we can work together to develop a new technology pushing forward on the frontiers of human knowledge, particle beam and laser beam defense systems, which can knock out missiles, incoming missiles. So instead of mutual assured destruction, it would be mutual assured defense and survival. This was what Reagan went with. Reagan adopted Larouche's policy, and he was then subjected to similar kind of wild hysteria by the press and others, the same kind of thing that Larouche was being subjected to. And then ultimately, unfortunately, he got, sick. They tried to kill him. That didn't work, but then he got sick, and things turned over basically to the Bush League, to the Bush faction of the Republican Party. So that never went anywhere. It got stopped. And as a result, we're still living under mutual assured destruction. The Chinese and the Russians are trying to counter that, trying to say, why don't we take the space program where we worked hand in hand with the United States in building the space station and other kinds of exploration? Why don't we use that as a model to collaborate on every aspect? Under the Trump administration, there was covert cooperation on countering terrorism in Syria. And once the Russians had moved in and actually helped the US, and the US helped the Russians in crushing most of the terrorist operations, Trump said, let's get the hell out of there. Let's get out of Syria. In fact, he ordered the commander-in-chief, ordered the military, get out of Syria. And the military said, go to hell, President Trump. We're not going to do it. And as a result, we now have a condition of outright genocide in Syria, where after 10 years of warfare, where the terrorists were armed by Bush and Obama, destroyed their major cities. And they were finally defeated, but instead we're going to the next stage. We're imposing sanctions. We're saying nobody can send in food or medicine. Nobody can help reconstruct that country, or we will punish them illegally, absolutely illegally, under the international law adopted and signed, and actually written by the United States after World War II. We're simply ignoring those international laws, imposing these vile, evil sanctions on countries that are starving to death, like Syria and Yemen. But this is the policy, because Trump was committed to the right ideas, but he failed. He couldn't do it. He couldn't overcome the empire and the military-industrial complex that was involved in that. So can we work with Russia to not only defeat terrorism, but to electrify and light up Africa? Absolutely. It would be tremendous benefit to our industries. We're one of the leading countries in these small modular reactors. If we were to work with China and Russia on policies for developing all of Africa, we would have huge markets for some of our advanced technology, not just IT, but these small modular reactors that are being developed with potential of fusion, which is being developed by some of our small fusion entrepreneurial projects, which we're going to write up for the next issue of our EIR, by the way. So this is the potential. We're at a moment of potential nuclear war, of pandemic, starvation, economic, financial explosion, but it's a moment of tremendous hope to a certain extent, because people are finally waking up to how evil this global policy is, the Green New Deal and so forth. So Mr. Larouche told me when I first saw him in a conference 50 years ago, he said, you know, nobody's going to want to hear what I have to say about how these policies, if they're not reversed, are going to lead to depression and war and pandemics. But when they happen, then people will look back and say, who's been telling us the truth and who's been lying? And this is the moment we're in. It's a moment of tremendous potential, where the Schiller Institute, in our international conferences, pulling together leading speakers from throughout the world who say this is the approach we have to adopt. People, come on, wake up, join us. And people like yourself, John, who put this out on the media so that people can break through the media containment and brainwashing about climate change and about the evil of the Russians and the human rights violations of the Chinese. You can break through that and hear the truth.
Well, yeah, that's what we're trying to do here. And I know you guys have been doing it for a long, long time, and you do it very well. Well, let's, I was going to ask you about the small nuclear reactors. I want to know more about them. I have the sense that this is the future of energy, that these small nuclear reactors are going to somehow start slipping their way into our lives. I know most people still have a kind of a Homer Simpson of the Simpsons view of nuclear power plants, and think of him kicking back with his donuts while the bolts are flying out of the machine. That has turned or empowered a lot of people to just disregard nuclear, but maybe he's kind of like the Borat of Kazakhstan, to get people to not look at what's really going on, because what's really going on is the huge amount of development of nuclear power, and it's been suggested that perhaps these small nuclear reactors and the uranium that powers them are going to be basically the new power system for the world, and that is where the money is who's going to control that. Tell me more about, from your point of view, who's developing these? You say the United States is ahead in that. Do you know what companies and what applications are they looking to use them for?
Well, NuScale, you just had that video up. I mean, NuScale has already developed these small nuclear reactors. Actually, Russia's ahead. Russia has used the reactors they had in the nuclear submarines, and they developed them to have what's called floating nuclear reactors, which they've already produced. They've already floated some into the cities on the Arctic to basically provide fuel for the development of new cities in very difficult terrain. But they're offering those to countries like the Philippines and Indonesia, where you can float one of these nuclear reactors into a harbor and basically fuel an entire city and an expanding port and development corridor. So this is in the works. But when I say the U.S. is ahead, the NuScale projects, I think, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert on this, but as I understand it, they're very close to being able to relatively mass produce these small modular nuclear reactors. And modular is important because you can put them into one area, and then if you need to put in another one, it can be directly linked up so that you can go from 300 or 400 megawatts up to 6 or 8 megawatts, and then further on if you need to as it develops. Building one of these huge nuclear plants, the 1,000 and 1,100 megawatt plants like we generally produce these days, it's very expensive, and it's more effective if you're fueling a huge industrial area. But if you want to develop the underdeveloped areas, then these small module reactors are absolutely perfect. We could spread them all over Africa, for instance. And as you know, Helga Zepp-LaRouche has proposed through her Committee on the Coincidence of Opposites to deal with this pandemic and the famine that's now sweeping Africa with the only real solution. It's not just sending vaccines. It's not just sending aid. It's building a modern health capacity in every single country. But a modern health capacity just doesn't mean hospitals. You have to have the energy to fuel a hospital. You have to have clean water. You have to have transportation capacity. So it basically poses the issue of, are we going to do what Roosevelt originally wanted to do and use American system methods to build these countries into modern industrial economies, which the Chinese are trying to do at their scale. But if it was done together with the US and Russia and others who would join, Japan would join, South Korea would join, then you would have the capacity for transforming the threat of a new dark age that we're now facing now with war and famine and economic disintegration, with a new paradigm, a paradigm based on the idea that there's a common aim for mankind and that we can address that and meet that, both for the Earth and for the development of space and the exploration of the solar system and beyond. These are all issues that require that kind of cooperation. And nuclear obviously will be at the center of it. And as I said, the potential, near-term potential for fusion power, which would literally transform civilization. It would create an unlimited amount of energy based on using the resource of seawater, basically, heavy deuterium, heavy hydrogen in seawater, and helium-3 that we could mine in the moon, which is even more efficient. But these are processes that the Chinese have declared that they think they will have functioning fusion online by 2040. Nobody else in the world has forecast that. But as you may have noticed, when the Chinese declare they're going to do something, they get it done. So especially if we're working together, this could be pointing towards truly a new paradigm for mankind within the next decade or two.
Yes, if we work together. My strong sense is that the people that are holding the reins of power in the West right now, that is what Harley Schlanger calls the banker's dictatorship. The money of the City of London, Wall Street, and Silicon Valley now thrown in, that huge amount of money, and more behind that, I'm sure, and the Bank of International Settlements and all the everything else, Swiss Re. I mean, we could just keep on talking about funds of unimaginable wealth, but they're all on the other side. They're all the ones that are threatened by the idea of developing Africa. I mean, yeah, Africa's what, 3 times as big as the United States, 4 times as big. I mean, you could see that China, United States, and Europe can all fit within the boundaries of Africa geographically. It's a huge place, and if they ever took off on their own, you know, some say Muammar Gaddafi was trying to develop its own an African currency, an African economy, and to just say, well, you know, take a hike, Western world, we don't need you anymore. That is the big threat, isn't it? That's where this incredible amount of resources is. And if these banks are now holding the reins through their powers of lending and controlling of governments ever lost control of that, then there would be a competing economy that would develop that would probably pretty soon swamp anything that could be produced in the city of London. Just considering the tremendous potential, if you let them have this infrastructure, if they had super highways and trains going, bullet trains and all of that wonderful infrastructure, then would not Africa become the most powerful place in the world, or a threat to be, something that the banks just can't let to happen? See what I'm saying? I'm sure.
That's a wonderful graphic you have up there. I'd never seen that before. Well, look, it's true. That's the banker policy. But, you know, there's another fact which can't be put aside, which is that they're bankrupt. They've been printing in the range of $2 to $3 trillion every year, long before the pandemic, by the way, to try to prop up what they know is a bankrupt financial system. The system basically collapsed in 2008. And instead of doing what we should have done, what Roosevelt did in 1933 when he came in, he put the banks through bankruptcy proceeding. And those that could show that they had cleaned out the wild speculative paper that had no value, the gambling debts, they were not only allowed to keep open, but they were given federal credits that had strings attached. This had to go into the real economy. Those banks that couldn't prove that were shut down and they went out. Now, we didn't do that in 2008. Instead of under Bush and then Obama, we said, we're not going to put any bankers in jail. We're not going to shut down any banks. We're going to massively turn on the printing presses, bail out the banks, to hell with the real economy. We're going to keep these, and not just American, European, British banks as well. US money, trillions of dollars going into the European banks. This was very much a British imperial policy run through the city of London and Wall Street. And now, where do we stand? You know, even before the pandemic, they just turned on the printing presses. And during the pandemic, trillions of dollars, $7-8 trillion, virtually none of that going into the real economy. So Larouche had a thing called a triple curve, which showed real production going up one way and financial paper going up much higher, and basically the debt structure going up even higher, and then finally kaboom, collapsing. Now we're now seeing, you've probably seen, John, that already the Wall Street Journal and the financial institutions are acknowledging that we're threatened with a hyperinflation, huge inflation, housing, copper, metal, food, right? Because there's all this money flushing around and there was no real development to prop it up. So what's happening? It's turning into inflation. And even, I think it was Yellen, or maybe, I forget if it was Yellen or one of the top people, who said, yeah, there might be hyperinflation, but it'll be temporary hyperinflation. Now, that's a contradiction in terms, you know. There's no such thing as temporary hyperinflation. We're threatened with a policy which could turn into something like Germany in 1923. And everybody knows the stories of wheelbarrows full of money to buy a loaf of bread, you know. Or just a general breakdown of the banking system like began in 2008 and was bailed out with printing money. They can't print money now. You can't. Interest rates are already zero. They're already doing quantitative easing at $250 billion a month and trillions more in these so-called sustainability funds. There's no more they can do. So the whole banking system could collapse, which would be just as bad in a different way. If you have hyperinflation, everybody's savings is suddenly turned into zero. If you have a general breakdown of the economy, then there's no jobs. We have something worse than 2008, far worse. So there's only one solution. And after 2008, Larouche made clear that the U.S. could not save itself. Even if they adopted Larouche's proposals for a new Bretton Woods and for transforming our auto industry into producing nuclear power facilities and other things, even those policies, he said, won't work. We have to have the major nations of the world, what he called the four powers, Russia, China, India, and the US, coming together and doing what Roosevelt did with the banking holiday after he came to power, put the global financial system through bankruptcy proceedings, keep those alive who are willing to wipe out or able to wipe out the speculative junk, and let the others go. Many of those speculative banks simply don't deserve to exist any longer. But then through Hamiltonian government policy, where the government generates credit, not the private banking system, but the government itself, as Hamilton laid out. That's why Americans survived the British Empire. Generate that credit with very strict strings attached that it goes to the general welfare for industry, agriculture, infrastructure, schools, hospitals, the things that the general welfare demands. We could get out of this, and we would get out of it in collaboration with the other great nations on earth, with China and Russia, which ironically, as I've said before in your show, it's very ironic that China is now actually implementing the American system while the US is succumbed to the British system.
Yeah, it's terrible. It's worse than ironic. It's a tragedy of our lifetimes, because all of our savings are at stake, as you said. And to think of our savings just turning into zero by virtue of hyperinflation is no. I don't even want to think about that. And most Americans are willing to eat that blue pill, if you will, just to not have to think about that. Because why should I trouble myself with the idea that the world might end? That's equivalent. If my savings are gone, then I have nothing. I'm totally screwed. So I don't even want to think about that. So there's a psychological barrier to thinking about that. It's created, well, by the whole idea of economists. Well, I won't get into the economists' theories because it's too complicated, but the idea that there's something good about just living off of the float, that there's $20 trillion of debt there, but as long as everybody pays their debts on a daily basis, everybody's going to be fine. The consumer economy, let the consumers fix everything by going on buying sprees and things like that. That we're kind of told that this kind of false economy is somehow going to sustain itself. And of course, you're pointing out the obvious, that it just can't. It can't do that. Well, that's not a cheerful picture. But you say we could go through a bankruptcy type of procedure, such as Franklin Roosevelt did when he did the bank holiday. And I had forgotten about that. I'm glad you brought that up. How do we protect our savings while forcing the banks through a bankruptcy?
Well, that's a serious problem. For instance, most of the pension funds that working people depend on for their retirement have been increasingly pumped into hedge funds or hedge fund type speculative activity. The managers are told, well, you have to do the best for your people. Therefore, you have to get the most profitable thing. And investing in safe things isn't profitable anymore. So you have to invest in hedge funds. So we must put this system through a formal bankruptcy process There's going to be you can't simply allow all of these funds, which have systemically dragged in things like pension funds. You can't just let that go under. You're going to have to create institutional structures which will make sure that people survive. They're not going to survive if we don't do this, because the whole thing is simply going to blow in an uncontrolled manner. But if we do it in a controlled way, as Roosevelt did, I mean, if you're not familiar with it, I mean, the day he took office, he declared a banking holiday. All the banks were closed overnight. And he set up a commission, a federal commission, which examined each and every bank, and those which could clear out their speculative junk and still had some true assets, they were allowed to stay open. And the government issued credits from the government, issued credits through the banking system, but they had to go into the real economy. And those that didn't were shut down. And he also implemented the Glass-Steagall. I'm sure you've talked about Glass-Steagall in your show many times, which from that point forward, there was a strict division between commercial banks, which took in deposits from citizens and were only allowed to invest into the real economy. They were not allowed to speculate. They were not allowed to buy stocks and bonds with that money or insurance. The speculative banks, the so-called investment banks, were under different rules, and they were not allowed to take in deposits. They could only take in rich people's money who were willing to risk it, and they could invest it in anything they wanted. They could speculate. But if they ran into trouble, they didn't get government bailout the way the commercial banks did through the FDIC, because it was speculation. Now, what happened with the takedown of Glass-Steagall in the late 1990s under Alan Greenspan in the Clinton administration is that the big investment banks took over the commercial banks. So you have Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, for instance. They're merged. So then when the collapse hit, these speculative banks with tons and tons of wild speculative betting and derivatives and so forth, mortgage-backed securities, were bailed out by the federal government, by the taxpayer, right? Which simply made the question worse. And it's continued ever since. And then beginning approximately in September of 2019, before the pandemic hit, there began to be another breakdown like 2008, and the Federal Reserve and the Treasury again began printing money in huge portions. And that got more huge as the pandemic hit. But none of this was bailing out the economy. This was simply bailing out gambling debts, absolutely worthless gambling debts. And so we're now sitting on top of well over $2 quadrillion in derivatives. Quadrillion is a number almost impossible to conceive. It's 1,000 trillion dollars, and there's over $2 quadrillion in gambling debts squatting on top of the real economy in the United States. That's what, unfortunately, this is where Trump made his biggest mistakes. Trump kept pointing to the stock market. See, the stock market's going up. This proves that we're having a great economy. And he had a little bit of an industrial boom, but most of it was just financial speculation. And as a result, it didn't mean anything. So this is where we're now ready for a collapse to make the 1929 or 2008 collapse look like a clown show in comparison. We have to have this major power agreement to have a new Bretton Woods, to get together and put the world financial system through the kind of bankruptcy proceeding Roosevelt did with the American banking system. It's going to be tough. It's not easy, but there's no alternative.
I think that we should also consider the idea of money laundering and the money of organized crime and the drug trade. And I watched a week or so ago a 1993 presentation by Schiller Institute with a number of really good speakers, including Jeffrey Steinberg, who spoke on that topic and said, without Glass-Steagall, all of the dirty money, the money laundering money, gets its way into the quote unquote legitimate banking system. And as you say, the investment banks took over the commercial banks. I think, a lot of that quote unquote investment may turn out to have been the profits of illegal activities that has been going on for decades. The idea that we could just call that a bunch of bad paper and write it off may run up against some serious difficulties with the people that still believe in that paper as kind of a marker of some money that they really are going to get someday, and if they don't, there might be some problems. I think that there's a strong element of blackmail going on, being applied to our Congress to prevent them from doing the sensible things that you suggest, and to keep this dirty money laundering system in place. Because I mean, there's a lot of money at stake, and organized crime got involved in our financial system at least as early as World War II, when they started cooperating with CIA and all of that stuff. I don't think we can ignore that in looking for a solution. What do you think about that?
Well, at the time of the last financial blowout in 2008, at that time, the drug business was the biggest business in the world, far bigger than oil, for instance. And the UN drug czar at that time, I believe his name was Maria Costa, but he said that the banking system is absolutely drug dependent.
Mm-hmm.
And while it's true most of the bankers took cocaine, that's not what he meant. He meant the banks themselves would not survive without the drug money they were laundering through their system. And under the Obama administration, one after another of the major banks, Hong Kong, Shanghai, HSBC, Hong Kong, Shanghai Bank Corporation, Citibank, and others, were caught openly by the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and others, laundering billions of dollars in drug money through Mexico and Colombia and so forth, and elsewhere in the world. Caught. And what did Eric Holder, the Attorney General for Obama, say? He said, we made a deal with HSBC. They agreed they weren't going to do this anymore. And that way we could continue collaborating with them to look out for these kinds of illegal activities. Nobody went to jail. Nobody. In 2008, when the banks were caught with this wild speculative binge, nobody went to jail. My good friend from Japan, Kotagawa Daisuke, who was the head of the, in 1998, the Japanese banking system went under. And he was in charge for the Ministry of Finance in overseeing the banks. And they went after the banks for their speculation. They went to prison. He said several of his friends committed suicide. Right? But they were identified for the crimes they did that helped destroy the Japanese economy. And they then put the bank system through very strict, similar to Glass-Steagall type provisions. And he has spoken at our conferences many times, and he says it's just unbelievable that 2008 happened and nobody went to jail for the incredible crimes of the banking community, including the drug crimes, but even just the speculation itself. Nobody went to jail. Yeah, too big for jail. That's what they say. They say we can't put these people in jail. Well, we could have avoided the current disastrous circumstances had we treated the banking system like Roosevelt did after 2008, but we didn't, because we had presidents, both Bush and Obama, who were owned by Wall Street, who were owned by the drug business. Remember that Obama legalized drugs throughout the country, and it's now rampant. Everybody's legalizing pot. They're moving towards legalizing cocaine, legalizing the destruction of the minds of our children. Keep in mind what that means. This is devastating. And yet this is accepted as just an alternative way of entertainment to alcohol. No, this is the destruction of the minds of our children intentionally as a policy. It's what the British used to destroy China when they pumped opium into that country, and when the Chinese objected, they waged war and laid waste to their major cities so that they could have free trade. You can't object to our free trade, which means that we can sell you opium if you wish to. Right? This is being done to our nation, to our children today, and in Europe as well. So, you know, the anti-science mentality, the anti-nuclear, anti-fossil fuel, anti-development, this needs the drugging up of your citizenry. And that's what's taking place.
We've studied the heroin issue pretty intensely on my channel. The use of the Hallowell plan, which is, you know, Paul Hallowell, the CIA operative that ran the drugs from the Golden Triangle to Cuba, and then from Cuba they dispersed it during the Batista regime, and then when Castro came in, and they had to make other plans. But the whole idea of the infusion of opiates, and especially heroin, into our country in order to finance the off the books CIA activities in overthrowing country after country after country. Cui bonis? Who was that for? Well, it certainly appears to me that that was for Wall Street and for the United Fruit Company and for all of the deep state money of the ancient free traders that go back into the establishment of New England families going back before the Revolution. So this free trade idea is it sounds great, kind of like a liberal. I like liberal. That's a nice idea. Let's all be liberals. But liberal trade, you know, to the British, now you're talking about Adam Smith and Thomas Malthus and all of that insanity that is still driving financial policy of these banks that are taking everything from us through their control of government and through their manipulation of the banks, and you know, and then taxing us. If they can't tax us anymore with official taxes, then they tax us with inflation, right? They take our wealth by inflating the paper money in our hands. This is a criminal regime that is running this. In my opinion, you don't have to agree with me, but ever since John F. Kennedy, where we spoke about him at the beginning of the show, it seems like it's been they've been winning. The ones that want to put the money laundering money in with our investment in our local school system, so that we can't distinguish one from the other, and we have to go along with the money laundering, or else we'll lose our pensions. This scheme has really got us pinned down, like Gulliver pinned down by all the Lilliputians. But there's so many strings on us right now.
You're right. This is you know, it's free trade. The idea of free trade, or what in the United States often you hear in terms of the idea of we must defend the independence of the Federal Reserve. We cannot allow government interference with the magic hand, with the you know, Adam Smith's magic hand. And Lynn always used to say, you know, the invisible hand is really the hand that's stealing your wallet in the subway. You know, free market, free trade is just a nice sounding word, as you said about the word liberal, for the dictatorship of banks over sovereign governments. And increasingly, we have fallen prey to that in the US and most of Europe. Right? The independent, for instance, with the EU. What's the EU? The EU is a group of unelected dictators in Brussels who have power over the sovereignty of their nations in the EU. They gave up their sovereignty to a bunch of unelected bureaucrats. And here we've given up our sovereignty. We Americans have given up our sovereignty to a group of international bankers who run the Federal Reserve. This is no longer is the U.S. government running the policy. They're unfortunately complicit in having the Fed run it. But the Fed now has officially joined the International Green Finance Coalition of Central Banks, whose explicit stated policy is that we are going to forbid credit from being extended from ourselves or from any of the banks in our purview to coal, oil, gas, agriculture of certain kinds, industry, transportation, right? We're going to shut it down. Now, they have a few exceptions, like this thing I mentioned at the beginning about the offsets,
Mm-hmm.
They want to keep their military industrial complex in place, right? They have to keep their private jets running, and they can't do that on solar power or windmills. So they have offsets so that the corporations they need to keep producing to maintain the military industrial complex are going to be able to have so-called offsets, which of course are just an excuse for keeping the developing sector backwards. So it's not really helping anybody. It's just the corporations are paying a kind of tax, which supposedly is to make up for their carbon, but really it's a kind of tax to make sure we keep the third world backward and their raw materials available to us and not themselves, and that we can effectively form a new form of the British Empire with the green governors taking charge to make sure that the wogs, as the British used to call the local people, the wogs do what they're told. I mean, we're in that era. People look back and look at the evil of the British Empire with mass slaughter in India and other parts of the world. We're in that period in a mass slaughter that makes that slaughter pale by significance. 90% of Africa has energy only from coal. And if you shut down coal, as one fellow said in an article we have this week, he said, if you don't have energy, your baby dies. And I think that's the level of emotional message that has to be conveyed to people who are accepting this silliness about climate change.
Those of us that have Irish heritage, and I know you do, a lot of us were had relatives come here as a result of the British policy toward Ireland, and what we're seeing here is a British policy towards Africa, a continent of immensely larger proportions in so many ways, and to have seen it happen to our ancestors, to have seen it happen around the world to other people and other people's ancestors, it should raise a cry of sympathy and alarm for the people of Africa that are suffering and are going to continue to suffer from this rape of their continent by these evil banking interests that are continuing to keep their structure together long beyond the time that it should have been declared bankrupt and put through a cleanup process so that they could get back to honest banking to serve the needs of the people that they're supposed to be serving as they're working under sovereign governments with the permission of the people. This has got to be restored. The people have to be sovereign, and our governments have got to clean this up. Thank you so much, Mike. Few closing words. I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sure you've told your audience before, we published a pamphlet called The Great Leap Backwards, Stop, Crush the Green New Deal. Larouche crushes the Green New Deal. And I encourage you to call us, to call me or to call Marshall Maluk or call John, and he can put it through to us to get a copy of that report, which we need massively circulated everywhere we possibly can to expose this.
Yes, and I agree with that. I have a few copies myself, and am encouraging my friends to read it. I hope that everyone will do that to give some text to what you're saying, to show that the homework has been done. The facts are there. And here's the disaster that awaits us if we don't stop this supposed Green New Deal. All right, guys. Mike Billington, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. It's fun.
Okay. Good night, everybody.